Hello. So in this video, I'm not necessarily giving you a lesson plan, but it's a fairly well-developed activity. I usually do this for about half of a 50-minute class period along with something else. This semester I did my lesson on Ethos, which I've done in another video. But this is a really good activity, I think, for teaching students about the rhetorical triangle and getting them to think about the different components of, or the three different rhetorical appeals, getting them to think about these appeals in relationship to one another. So what I do is typically on each of the three walls of the classroom, other than the front wall, I'll tape up a sign with the name of one of the rhetorical appeals. So maybe Ethos on that wall, Pathos on the back wall, and Logos on that wall. Whatever it is, it doesn't matter. Whatever order you want to do it in. Or if your room is configured weirdly, like I've done, like one of my rooms is weirdly set up, so I've done one on the back wall, one sort of in the back portion of this wall, and one in the front portion of this wall. Whatever it is, you want three distinct spaces because you have your students get up and walk to whichever section of the wall or whichever sign they think is the most important or persuasive of the rhetorical appeals. So again, if you put Ethos over here and they think Ethos is most important, they head to that wall in a group. If you put Logos in the back, they think Logos is most important, they head to the back. If you put Pathos on this wall, you get what I'm saying. So they self-divide into three groups for supporting each of the rhetorical appeals. And I do often tell them, even if you don't have a particular appeal that you think is most important or persuasive, choose one of them. Be in one of the groups. So then I give them some time to come up with at least three reasons, either why their appeal is the most persuasive or why the other appeals are less effective. They need to come up with at least three reasons. Coming up with more is obviously better because then you can, then they can choose what are their strongest reasons. And I tell them their goal is going to be to persuade other people to join their group. So after I give them some time, I put the three appeals up on the board, chalkboard or whiteboard or whatever it is. And then I go through and I have each group give me one of their reasons. We do this in 3 rounds. So I get one reason from Ethos, one reason from Logos, one reason from Pathos, put them up on the board. And then I ask if anybody is persuaded and wants to switch to a different group. But generally, nobody does. I do tell them it's okay to change your mind, it's okay to be persuaded and to grow as a human being, but very often people don't change their minds throughout the entirety of the activity. So that's not unusual, that's not necessarily a problem. So then we go through a second round. One reason for Ethos, one reason for Logos, one reason for Pathos, put them up on the board. Is anybody persuaded? Go through a third round. One reason for each group, put them up on the board. Is anyone persuaded? So what this does is it gets students thinking about how you would convince people who think one of the other appeals is more effective to join your group. This is rhetoric in action in that sense, is that you have a distinct goal and a distinct rhetorical audience that you're attempting to convince to agree with you. And you're providing reasons, you're providing rationale. Then I sort of have them come back and just go back to their seats. And we talk some about the rhetorical triangle as such. So sometimes I will sort of address specific points that have been put up on the board. Like the Logos group will almost always go with, you can't argue with facts and statistics. And I will often, that's a particular pet peeve of mine, that idea. Because I will often remind them that it's not necessarily an issue of arguing with facts and statistics. It's a question of arguing with interpretations. Because I always tell my students evidence is not self-evident. A piece of data is not in itself meaningful until it's put into an interpretive framework. And we can disagree about the interpretive framework. Of course, we now live in a world of alternative facts, and so we can disagree about facts as well. But you set that aside, or you address that. I've done both. But that's the kind of thing. If there are particular points up on the board that I want to talk about, I'll do that briefly. I always ask my students, because I have them read the section of Aristotle's Rhetoric where he talks about the three rhetorical appeals. I always ask them if they remember what Aristotle says is the most important of the rhetorical appeals. And on very rare occasions, someone does remember that Aristotle favors ethos. Often they'll just sort of guess at random, and that's okay. They've got a 33 1/3% shot of getting it right. But I do sort of mention, because I think this is an interesting thing, I sort of mention that what Aristotle means by ethos is not what we tend to mean by ethos today. Because today we tend to talk about things like qualifications, criteria, or qualifications, credentials. Sorry, I don't know why I blanked on that word. Goodwill, trustworthiness, etc., etc. For Aristotle, that's not really what ethos is about. What ethos is about is the moral character of a speaker. So the idea, if you're a good person, you will make persuasive arguments, seems to kind of be what Aristotle is saying. But then the biggest thing we talk about at the end of this activity is how you can never have any of these rhetorical appeals functioning without the others. This is a rhetorical triangle because it's a unified structure. No, this is a rhetorical triangle because it's a unified structure where each of these three appeals supports the others. And that's really, really crucial. And I give a couple of examples of things that, even though they are driven by a particular type of appeal, like the ASPCA commercial with Sarah McLachlan's song and the injured puppies and kittens and things like this. This is very, very heavily driven by pathos, of course. But there's still ethos, there's still logos involved. And without it, if it was just pure emotion, we would not be persuaded, we would just be sad. The other example I tend to give is legal arguments. In court, in principle, the arguments that lawyers make should be driven by facts. They should be driven by interpretation of evidence, interpretation of law, etc., etc. They should be primarily logos. And yet, you need pathos and you need ethos involved in order to persuade a jury or a judge. So, these are some of the things that I really emphasize, is that in any given text, in order to be persuasive, even if it relies very, very strongly on a particular rhetorical appeal, it still needs the other two involved.